Yes, thank you very much. You can see my slide.
Yes.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so good morning, everybody, and very good early morning here from Finland. It's about 6:30, 6:40 Finnish time right here, which is all good. So I'm Chief Technologist at the Red Hat Global Telco team, and as you can see on the cover page, I have also been a long time at Nokia being a Finnish engineer, but also at Huawei and Samsung actually before joining Red Hat about 7 years ago. Now, Red Hat is obviously a open source company, 25 plus years, open source only, 100% open source, and all these things. And I'll talk a little bit in the beginning of our development model, which is not surprise for anybody, I would think, but I'll start with that. So as Arvid was saying, the best way to develop and the correct way, the right way to develop open source is to do it in upstream communities, open source upstream communities, to participate, to put your engineers in to the communities, community work, contributing not just code. There's many ways to contribute to open source in addition to creating source code, but source code is of course heart of everything. So we do that. We put our engineers in the open source upstream communities to make an impact. We integrate the projects, community projects, we downstream them, as we call it, and then eventually we stabilize the code and create Red Hat supported products. And put it in the other way, picking a selection of open source components or projects. Again, we work in the middle in many open source projects. I don't even know how many. And we actually work in tens of open source projects, which we don't even have a product for, because that's what Red Hat does. And again, then we downstream, then we stabilize. And the key point, as Arvid was saying several times, is to not to just consume the open source code or projects or contributions, but to heavily contribute back. And that has been Red Hat's model since the beginning. That's going to continue. We will not compromise our development model, which we call upstream, open source upstream first, the same words as Arvid was using. So just to frame this discussion that we do this, we don't do anything else. And since our products are based on open source components, open source is the only thing we do. So let's talk about these edge tiers. People and companies have different views and graphics and even opinions of what edge might mean and what core might mean and so forth. So I have on the left-hand side of the slide, I have the endpoints, user devices or IoT devices or anything like that. And we as Red Hat, we don't play in user device or IoT device space, but on the edge, device edge, end user premise edge, provider edge, and so forth, and of course enterprise core or network core. We play a lot, and I just have dropped many of these logos we already saw in the previous presentation to this slide. It's obviously not complete in any way, but just trying to paint the landscape where these industry alliances and open source projects are. But then I also have a de jure standardization like 3GPP on the left-hand side. So I will talk a little bit about standards and open source, how they go together, because they go together very well. And both standards and open source have their own role, this whole kind of a complex picture and complex world. Now, what we try to do, and we are not the only ones, Red Hat is not the only one, but what we try to do among many other things, of course, is that we work in these organizations on the left-hand side, many of those. And this is, again, just a selection of organizations. There are so many, as we all know. We work in these organizations, which can be de jure standardization. They can be de facto industry alliances like ANUKET or Oran Alliance or you name it. We work in those, many of those, not all, because there are so many. And we try to, so we get what these organizations are developing in terms of requirements or API specification maybe, or whatever they might do. So we take those work results from these organizations and we try to translate those requirements, if you will, into the language to be communicated and socialized with the open source communities, upstream communities in the middle of the slide. Again, just a selection of some open source projects, not a complete list. So we try to translate those requirements and specs and things into the language for open source communities, developers, maintainers, and whatever people or whichever contributions people are doing for open source communities. And then, if lucky, many times lucky, so the open source communities take these things, and telco industry has been a very, very good example during the NFV years, I would say, starting 2012, to start influencing open source communities. OpenStack, of course, in the beginning, now Kubernetes, ONAP, DPDK, OVS, you name it. So do that in open source communities, and then we, of course, take, as I said, explained earlier, we downstream those open source community releases into and put it into our open source upstream first development model. And then one more emphasizing the diagram on the right-hand side, that the vast majority of Red Hat software developers, our engineers, they work in open source communities directly, not in Red Hat own projects. And another thing to emphasize is that, which I will actually talk a little bit later, that we do not fork. We do not fork open source projects. That's fundamentally important for us. All right, going forward a little bit on edge evolution. So we have been on this journey, or telco industry has been on this journey towards open source since the introduction of NFV, I would say. Before that, before 2012, of course, telco industry used open source on IT side a lot. Telco industry used also open source on the telco networking side to some extent, but not really in a major way, I would say. But NFV changed a lot. You know, NFV introduced the virtualization platform in the beginning. OpenStack is as one of those open source projects. And telco leaders, you know, at the service providers, they started to realize that this open source is the thing which can be actually be used, and it can be high quality and so forth. So during all these years, telco industry has been more and more comfortable of using open source. And now, when we have been building telco 5G or 5G core, far edge, multi-access edge computing, and all that stuff for a number of years, open source is kind of a default for many domains in building 5G networks. You know, the platforms, cloud platforms, is almost by default, it's open source. Automation tools are open source, and orchestration like ONAP, OSM, they are open source, and so forth. So telco industry is comfortable of using open source. Obviously, there are always exceptions, but generally speaking, open source is here and is going to be here to stay for long. So that's the phase number one was obviously NFV for 4G. Now we are going for 5G big time. And I have one example of 5G when we go towards the end of this presentation. Manufacturing, AI, ML, and all these things are happening based on open source. And the key thing is to enable open source in these domains and replicate the success in different industry segments, which is happening as we speak, with the help of people like the Linux Foundation and companies, commercial companies as well. Just an example of Akraino Edge, which Arvid was talking about. I probably have old diagrams here, but this is just an example of a great exercise under Linux Foundation and contributed by a lot of individuals in this world, including Red Hat, although we don't have a product which matches directly to what Akraino Edge is doing. But when we look at all these components in this blueprint, which again I think is a bit old, these components are highly valuable to be used in other places as well, in addition to Akraino itself. But a good example of great community collaboration. Now, this is the important slide. Coming back to don't fork community releases or open source projects. Open source projects, because it's obviously not a good idea, and it is going to be expensive if you do that. If you base your product, your commercial product on forked open source project, it's going to be expensive. So the left-hand side here is our model, Red Hat model. So we try to stay as close to community development mainline releases as ever possible. Obviously, there are very small deviations when you look at the different points of time. There are small deviations pretty much all the time when there is, for example, a security breach, and that has to be fixed without even talking to Upstream community at that point of time. It has to be fixed, but eventually it always comes back to mainline. So this is our model, and this model is not going to change at Red Hat. Now, the right-hand side of the slide, it's easy to understand that what happens when you start branching the community development or community releases and add your own features without contributing back to mainline community or open source community. You will create your own branch, and eventually, people realize that hey, open source, this community which my product is based on has created fantastic, nice features, and I need those features. So how can I get those features into my product, because I don't have them on my branch? So then we come to this merging community development mainline and vendor branch, and then it tends to repeat itself, which is the lower right-hand side diagram. So it tends to repeat itself. So merging again, and merging again. And as Arvid was saying, this is extremely expensive for the company who is doing this. So, and not being able to take all the advantages of the open source mainline code. And again, we don't do that. Now, this is an interesting slide, and I have this because of the reason. So this kind of describes telco industry journey starting from late 2012, 2013, when network function virtualization white paper was released by about 15 major service providers, calling for commodity hardware to be used and converting the network functions into software appliances. using virtualization platform, which is on the left-hand side. And OpenStack in Red Hat's term was the platform, and which is a good example of a open source project which is highly successful and well contributed. It was, and it still is, and it continues to be for years to come. Now, things started to change. So Kubernetes came on board, and some people started to embed Kubernetes in their network function on top of OpenStack. Several different Kubernetes platforms embedded into one deployment, which is not obviously good. A lot of lifecycle management challenges and all these things. The next phase was to drop that and have a single consistent Kubernetes container platform on virtualization, OpenStack in this case, and have cloud native network functions on Kubernetes. And now, of course, the current model, which is very important for edge, it's very important for Open RAN or ORAN, because footprint reasons and performance reasons and all these reasons is to drop the virtualization and have a consistent Kubernetes platform on bare metal and hosting the network functions. Now, this is happening actually very quickly, and why I have this 3GPP block in this slide is highly interesting thing, because 3GPP service-based architecture as a standard by 3GPP, it has accelerated this movement specifically because 3GPP has taken a completely novel approach how to standardize mobile network 5G or network 5G RAN and core. So they are calling for things like containers, microservices, cloud nativeness, and all these things, which is and software-based approach instead of box-based approach. And this standard has really accelerated this transformation towards Kubernetes container platform on bare metal for all use cases. It's a very, very interesting phenomena, and fantastic, of course, not just from telco standardization point of view, but software industry point of view and open source point of view as well. Now I have this one example, which is it's an ugly slide, sorry about that. I'm not good in these things, but this in one slide shows the Open RAN or vRAN or ORAN, whatever you might want to call it. There is a confusion, as Arvid was saying, with these terms. So transition from a vertically integrated base station on the left-hand side, a lot of stuff on the cell side, to a model which has this change of the model has a very, very many different reasons why this happened, good reasons. One reason which I tried to make visible on this slide is to make the cell site as simple as ever possible. Nothing to do with open source, or not much to do with open source, but that was the motivation, one of the motivations, many others. And so the ORAN and Open RAN model is on the right-hand side, meaning that there is a 3 entities radio unit on top of the mast still. Then there is a distributed unit next to the cell site on cloud platform, potentially. And then the next aggregation point is the centralized unit on another cloud platform. The cloud platform can and should be exactly the same, which is possible, and that's what we do, open source cloud platform. And this is a standard by 3GPP, this model, this disaggregation model. But 3GPP did not specify the interfaces and open architectures. That's where ORAN Alliance comes into the picture, as well as Telecom Infra Project. But the point here is that the CU side, the virtual CU side or centralized unit side on my right-hand side picture, that is the location of edge data center. And in addition to centralized unit entities, operators can onboard any other edge applications they might have, like and have a multi-access edge compute compliant implementation, or just enterprise edge applications, because the CU side is the first place when the local breakout of the user traffic can happen, which I have simply shown on the very right edge of this slide. Just an example where open source fits really well. Cloud platform for disaggregated RAN based on ORAN architecture and ORAN model. The workloads obviously can also be open source. Nothing prevents that, and that would be nice. But we as Red Hat, we do the cloud platforms. Now, my last slide, just a few recommendations on my part. Upstream first model is the right model, as now has been said like 25 times already this morning, because by doing that, you can get all the benefits of open source communities, open source code, open source contributions, and you don't kind of replicate the problem of having been mandated to maintain your code yourself. And again, the standards and open source go well together. Both are needed. And an example of the standard is radio interface, for example, and protocol over the radio interface. It's not too long ago, 2005 or so, or before 2005, if I had to, being in Finland, if I had to go to US or Japan, I had to have a phone matching those countries, because it was not a global standard. Now it is. My phone works everywhere, and it has to stay so. So that's an example of a standard which cannot go away. There are tons of others. But open source, when we look at how the network elements are implemented, open source is fundamentally important, and open source creates de facto standards as well, which was mentioned earlier. So just focus on your communities, which are relevant to you and your systems, and prioritize your participation in the communities based on what you need, and of course based on the community health. Community health and people and companies around the community is crucially important. So I'm going to stop here, and I used a bit more time than I was planning to, but well done.
Thank you very much, Timo. It was really insightful. One of the important points that you highlighted was how the different vendor solutions come together and the challenges that we face and how it has been solved. I think open source and standards together can surely solve these problems very well and increase the speed of development as well. Thank you once again.